Welcome back to Our Community. Susie Thomas with Dr. Jane Hoyt Oliver, Chair of Social Work and Psychology Department, and a local author from Malone University, and an adoptive mom.
Yes.
And very proud of her daughter, who's now an adult. You had said in our first segment, you know, you're trying to figure out how do you always communicate love as you're navigating all these issues. And that became this book. So how do you? What are those themes that you were talking about? What is that wish list that you were talking about that became the chapters of this book? Fill us in.
Well, I think one of the things that I think is important is to think about, you start with who you are. So one of the things that many of the parents that we interviewed, and we interviewed mainly Caucasian families, that many of the Caucasian families didn't grow up in a multicultural environment. And that many of them said, I never thought about race growing up. And if you don't think about race growing up, sometimes you don't have the tools to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the people, that comes from something that sociologists and social workers call white privilege, the privilege of not having to think about who you are in the context of society.
Oh yeah, you ask an African American person to describe themselves. African American is going to be one of the top 10 things. You ask a Caucasian person to describe themselves, they're going to go into, well, I like to do this, I do this and this. Your race does not come to mind,
Right.
And it is a different perspective completely for these folks who wanted to adopt and wanted to adopt transracially. What was there some kind of a theme of what drove them to do it? What was the desire to do it in the first place?
I think those were as separate as the parents themselves.
Okay.
So there were some people who just felt out of a sense of social justice. They wanted to see a world that was more multicultural, and so they were going to start their community that way. There are some folks, there were two couples in our study who were gay. And so in their case, they were having, in their community at the time, it was really difficult for gay families to adopt other children. So they were willing to adopt children who were a little harder to place. And so they became transracially adopting parents. Other folks were inspired by some folks that they knew. Another couple, one of the parents of the couple had been foster parents to 40 or 50 foster kids.
Wow.
And so had been very interested in, living into this kind of community. So I think in many cases it was the stories themselves were all different and they were all important. But it clearly was a decision. Some parents, thought, well, we want to begin our family. And so to begin our family, we will do what we can do. And we will adopt a child, and we'll bring that child into the family, and we will love that child deeply. And so, again, all of these are different stories.
Tell us a little bit about some of the chapters in your book.
Okay. Well, that first chapter actually is called "I Never Thought About Race Growing Up," because that really, again, can frame a lot of the expectations that parents have. If they haven't had to think about race, sometimes adopting parents will think, all I need to do is to love a child. Race doesn't matter. And within the family, that can easily be the case. But outside the family, it still is not the case. We do not live in a post-racial society. And as Kevin Hoffman, who is one of the authors of one of the In Her Voices chapters, said, I grew up in a happy to be white community. That you wouldn't hear that kind of a conversation, a sort of a lighthearted but very important phrase from a person usually who's Caucasian in the 21st century, but certainly for him that was the case. And so having that conversation is really important. How do you deal with race? Several of the families talked about racial incidents that occurred. One person who had an African-American family, when she was young, probably in elementary school, come to the community and have that family literally not able to get out of their car when they were coming to look at a house because they were being stoned by the neighborhood.
Oh, what year was this?
I would probably say the 60s or early 70s.
Oh, my.
So she was very disturbed by that.
Yeah.
And for her, that sort of started a journey for justice in her own life.
Sure.
The interesting part for me about that was that there were plenty of other children around that day, and who knows if any of them remembered it, or if any of them ever, the people on the outside of the car, if any of them ever said, oh, well, maybe that's the way it has to be, or all those different things. Of course, every member of the family in the car, of course, are going to remember that story.
Yeah.
So for parents who are adopting transracially, they need to sort of begin to think a little bit about some of the history that of African American people in this country that have caused discrimination and inequality, because that provides them with a way of talking with their children about some of the issues and concerns that may arise. To be very proactive, for example, about understanding the history of African American contributions to society, to read and go to movies, and to there's so much wonderful literature that provides a much more nuanced understanding of history than certainly I got, as now I'm in my 60s. That certainly I got, and I got an excellent education all the way through, but I really learned only one aspect of American history.
It was a different reality.
Exactly right.
Tell us another wish list item.
I think another thing is, again, all of our parents talked about hair, and we called it sort of hair as a metaphor. That we really, parents need to spend some time thinking about how they're going to enter into the culture of their child as a way of strengthening the child's own understanding of the positive contribution that people have. All of the people in this country have given to the country. So
Right.
Not expecting that, basically learning from people who can help you, and asking for help when you need it. One person, for example, took her sons to the barbershop once a month to have their hair cut, and sat and listened, talked to people. And this person, talked about early on, this was tough because she was going into a community that she didn't really know, and she was living, and, that she didn't know any of the people, and people were suspicious of her. But then realizing that that's often what her kids were experiencing when they were living at home with her. So again, then beginning to form relationships at the barbershop, beginning to have that opportunity to get to know, to hear the voices of other people who have lots of experience, and it became a really positive thing.
It just makes a difference once you know a person. Racism is a two-way street. There are African American people who are racist against white people. There are white people who are racist against black people. It's a two-way street, but once you have formed a relationship with a person, it really opens up a whole new world, doesn't it?
Well, and I think that what social workers call cultural humility, that sense of, you know what, I don't know everything. And as a parent, it's, basically once a child is over 5, I think it's really okay not to know everything. I think it's helpful because then you can listen better. And so part of what we tried to do, I know, again, we lived in predominantly white communities, so one of the things that we often did was when we went on vacation, we went places where there would be lots of things going on that would be more inclusive. We took her to shows that would celebrate, culture, and that she would see people doing amazing things. And so part of what we tried to do is to say this is the world we're living in. This is a larger world. This is the history you're learning. This is another part of history. And that, again, is wonderful for children because it gives them a sense that although the world is, this world is comfortable, there's another huge world out there that is going to be inviting you in. So that was part of what we tried to do.
Very interesting. Let's try and touch on one more. Another thing that was on parents' wish list that became a chapter in your book. Wish we would have known this.
Yeah, I think often the other thing that parents wished they had known was how their relatives and extended family were really thinking, quote
Interesting.
unquote. Because in many cases, parents, who are adopting really want to be loving their children, love their children unconditionally, and sort of assume that because they've done that their parents and their grandparents,
and their
uncles and aunts are going to be just fine with that. This is something that it happens to all adopting families. There are people who sort of separate out grandchildren by adopted children and non-adopted children.
Oh, my.
So there's that separation. But several of the parents in our study talked about there being a sense of there are the one parent said the real children, and then there are the other children.
Oh, my.
And so one of the things that we really recommend is that parents or potential parents sit down with their families and say, this is what we're thinking of doing, and how are we going to manage it? Now, if you don't like it, we may still do it, but we need to know what the parameters are, and you need to know what we're going to be what's going to be acceptable and not. And these are the consequences if not, so that parents can decide themselves together as a unit how they're going to assist their family to talk about those issues. It's difficult to do that as children are growing up. If children are infants, they can sort of get away with figuring that stuff out. But soon, I would say probably by 3 or 4, children begin to understand if things are different. So it's very helpful. And also making sure that you don't lie. I mean, so we didn't talk about this in the book, but there was a situation in one family that we talked about who the adoptive mom talked about the fact that her child was transracial and they were adopting, and grandma knew. Sister said, is this child African American? And mom lied and said no. And the parent said, why didn't sister just come to me? I would have told her the truth.
Yeah.
We have to deal with what's real. Do not lie. Again, because what happens is that at some point, then if sister comes back and says, there's no place to go with that conversation. And then the child begins to think, there must be something wrong with me, that people have to lie about who I am.
Oh, my. Yeah.
So you have to be really careful, not for the short run, but for the long run.
Yes. Good point. The book is Parenting in Transracial Adoption, Real Questions and Real Answers. Author Jane Hoyt Oliver, along with Hope Haslam-Strawn and Janie Schooler. Did I say that correctly?
Jane Schooler.
Jane Schooler. And congratulations on the book. You can get it through Amazon. And Jane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for being with us on Our Community.